Good morning. Today we're going to be looking at how to open a new activity or a new screen in Android using the Android Studio tool. So we are using that same project we were building with last time, our silly activity project. And up here we already have in our declaration section, we have a couple buttons. If we go look at our XML right now, we have a button for changing our colors as well as our text view. To do that, what we're going to do is we're going to add a new button in this screen so we can open up a new screen so we can keep our existing functionality. We can also check to make sure that they are still working in that level. So we'll go ahead and start off with that. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to add the new button so we can add that screen and switch to it. And I'm going to drag a button object over here from the palette and we'll put it down here at the bottom so it's totally separate from everything else. And we've got our button. And of course the first thing we want to do with the button is give it an ID. So I'll go over here to its properties section. Scroll down to ID, and instead of button, I'm going to call this the swap screen button. And we'll add some text in our strings.xml for it. We'll add a new string for it. Over here and in our strings section, we'll have a new tag of XML for string, and give it a name. And I'll call it swap screen text for that. And inside the tags is where I put the contents that will be going inside that button that we'll see. So if we make any changes to this or if we need to do any localization, we can make those changes for that. And so because I'm using this XML right here inside strings.xml and putting a string reference in this, I can use that same button text over both buttons, the button that's on the main screen and the button on the other screen. So I can click here, so I can click on using the same text to change the screen, not the button, excuse me. So I can have the same text on this button and on my other buttons when I'm using it to swap between screens. So go ahead and hit save on this, and again, every time it's saved, just like we talked about, you should be putting that probably in your GitHub account so you have it committed and you have any changes made for that. We've got our button right there. We'll go ahead and we'll change the text on that. We can do that by going over here down to the text. And in the text section, instead of new button, we'll use the three dots over here so we can go to our references that are built in. And if we go down to the bottom of this, we have obviously in our strings section, we have our built-in sections as well. But we have the ones that we made ourselves, and there's our swap screens text. I'll select that. It shows us a preview right here of the text that's included. Choose OK. And we immediately see that there is now a color, there's now a changed text right there for that button that's down there at the bottom of my screen. Again, saving that so I can move on. And our code right now, we're not going to make any changes to the code yet because we're simply doing design. What we want to look at first is the idea of we want to add that resource to it. So I'm going to go over here to the project section. In my project section, I'm going to go to the app section, then go to my source folder, and then go to the main, and then Java. And right here inside my package that we'll be using for this, I want to go ahead and right-click on it, and I'm going to choose New. And from my new options, I'm going to go down to my activity. The reason we're choosing activity instead of simply just making new classes, we want to actually have this linked directly to both its XML and its associated Java file, so we create both files at the same time. And we're putting it inside that same package because all of our activities will go together. And we're just going to use a blank activity for this. We'll scroll over here down to blank activity, just get that started, so we're going to show the basics for it. It'll bring up the activity customization pop-up screen or dialog box. And again, in class we always having the name activity as the suffix for everything we're doing when it's an activity-based Java file. We can go ahead, we'll call this the running activity since it's tying into our About Me project and I do a lot of running. And again, notice that when I make a change up here on the activity name, it makes an associated change of the layout, title, and menu resources. Right now what we'll be mostly using is the layout name itself. On the title itself, right now, as you can see, it does an exact copy of what we had for running an activity with no spaces. But instead of that, I'm going to change that here so it's actually what we'll see on the screen. And instead of having one single word combined in camel case, we use an actual sentence or a title that we could use for this. And we use Mr. H likes to run for our title, so we can actually see something that looks more like an actual screen for that. We want to make sure we do not choose to make this a launcher activity. We'll talk more about that later, but this is not what we want to do for when we're making new activities inside our project. We do not want to make them a launcher activity. But we're keeping our same package name because we're going to have that staying together. So hierarchical parent, we'd use that for using the up button as it says right here for that default implementation. Like so if we press the up button, where is it going to go back to? So we can easily keep that going for that. No biggie there. Go ahead and hit finish. Let's create an activity. Again, we'll notice over here that as this activity is built, we will have a brand new file right here called running activity in our Java file inside our package, and then in our res folder inside the layout folder we'll have a new XML attached to that as well. Here we have our running activity XML. We have our actual screen that we're going to be using for that, and we want, unfortunately, have that hello world, but that's okay. We can go ahead and simply just remove that from here. We don't need it, but we're going to go ahead and drag a new button over onto the screen, and I'm going to put it here in the middle. But to make sure this button is very visibly different from my other screen, so not only do I have the color changing, but I'll have this so it's just a very different screen. I'm going to make this so I can easily change the references out, so I can clearly see that I'm changing to different screens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here on my properties, and I have my button selected right here, and on its height, I'm going to give this a nice height of 150, and I'm going to take its width and also move it to 150 as well, so that way that this button itself is clearly different from everything else. And again, the text on this, we'll use that existing text that we made last time in our strings.xml, and we'll go ahead and click to it. We have that reference for the swap strings text. We'll grab that right there, so it says click here to change the screen. And again, we have that showing up right here on our screen. We'll go ahead and hit save for that. And so our XML, we have most of that done. We have one last thing we want to make sure we do is we need to make sure we give this as an ID. Again, button is not a great name for it. We want to have a name that reflects what it is and what it does, and this one's going to return to the home screen. So we're going to give this a name instead of button. We'll call this the return home button. Now, you do want to keep in mind that if you have a bunch of screens, you don't want to name them all return home button. You could return home from 1, or return home from 2, or return home from running, using another naming convention like that, so you can actually keep track of what exactly you're returning home from. But since we only have 2 screens on, the simply return home button will be a good name for it, because our names for our IDs of all of our objects or buttons inside XML need to be unique. And so we have that right here, so since I'm using that button, it needs an ID. Again, we can see it has an ID right here, right in our component tree, where it gives its name and then what type it is, and also the reference to the string that's in there, so we can have that same string and not have to type it more than once. Go ahead and save that. Our XML for this is done. We're going to go down to our running activity, and just like we did inside our other one, we have to give a reference to our button. We have to make sure we initialize our button, and then we have to provide a listener for it, and then provide a specific set of actions for that button to do, so it can actually go back to the home screen. So we'll go ahead and do all that again really fast. So first, in our declaration section right here, we'll make a private reference to a button, and we'll call it home button. That's a great name for it. We know exactly what it's doing. In the onCreate method, after we've called super.onCreate and set content view, we can now give our reference to our button to initialize it. And so I will say that home button equals, and we cast it as a button object. We call our findViewById method, and we'll pass it r.id.returnHomeButton. And again, I'm specifically using the typing here until you are very comfortable with the structure and ideas of Java, and especially of Android development. You want to make sure that you are giving references to this and typing it so you remember what you need to do. We can see immediately that we need to import our button because it's not properly in there, so we'll go to our import section, and we'll add a line for that. And so button is in the widget package, so we'll import. Android.widget.button, have that ready so we can now get rid of any errors that are attached to simply the definition of our button object. So it is imported, declared, and initialized. Now we need to go ahead and give our onClick for it, which means we're going to do our setUpListeners method. So we'll call method right here, and then we're going to go ahead and go down to our bottom. After our onOption is selected, we'll go down here and we'll create a new method for it. It is a private void method because it's a helper method that doesn't return anything. It attaches listeners to the objects that we may be using within this activity. And so it's a void method because it doesn't need to return anything. It simply calls it and makes sure it works properly at that point. And we'll call it setUpListeners because it's a great frame that we'll be using often throughout class. And we use it plural because of the fact that there are multiple times we're making different listeners for it. Usually most things will have more than one thing we're waiting to happen. And again, to have that link on that, we call our button name, and we call that name.setOnClickListener. For a parameter, we're going to pass it a new view.onClickListener. Because we're making a new onListListener, we have to go ahead and press enter right here. We assign some squiggles because we're creating a new instance of that object. We have a semicolon at the end of that line. And then there's a required method that must be in here to follow the interface guidelines that are attached to all listener objects. In the case of an OnClickListener, we need to have a method called onClick. It is a public method. It's a void type. And we type in onClick for the name. Again, the spelling in case on this matters. We have to make sure it has that. It requires a parameter of a view object. The view specifically is that which is attached to the button, so I call it button view. And then we have squiggles that go for that. And so right now we can see what we have, our basic setup listeners method, what we've made before. We have the home button.setOnClickListener passing it a new view.onClickListener, open and close parens, which creates an instance of that. And because we're making an instance of that listener, we have to also initialize the method for it. So public void onClick, passing it a view object I named button view. We have to go ahead and add our imports for that as well. So we'll scroll back up to the top right here and add our import for our view. Remember, for a view, it's import Android.view with a lowercase v .view with a capital V. So we're importing the views for that. And so we have right now the basic structure for both of our components. The way we're going to do this now is we're going to go back to our first activity, aka our silly or stupid afternoon activity, get that started up. And for its listener, we'll add a reference for a button on that. And so we'll make a new button in here. And again, in my declaration section, I like to keep them together by type. So we'll make another private button. And I'll call this one swap button, because it's going to swap the screens. And down here in my initialization section, again, I'm trying to keep these together, my swap button equals of type button. And we'll call the same method find view by ID. And I'll pass it for its parameter r.id.swap screen button, because that's what I named it on this other XML, the one for the stupid activity afternoon XML, so swap screen button. And again, it's important to make sure you put the right reference for the correct button. If you give references to, say, for example, both of them going to silly button, or I try and make silly words be the reference to the button, it'll cause compilation and other issues, and when it actually compiles inside Android and tries to run it, it will immediately cause a, unfortunately, your app has stopped working error, because it's trying to turn a non-button object into a button, or a non-text view object into a text view with this casting action that happens right here, which will cause the entire app to crash. Not generally the best idea. We already have made our setup listeners method, so we just have to go and attach a listener for this button as well. So we're going to scroll down to that. And so we have our color change button. Let's go after the end of the color change button listener. And so this is the swap screen button, or swap button, .setOnClickListener. And again, we're going to pass it a new view.onClickListener, just like we did earlier. Parens again, squiggles to start it off, a semicolon to end it, and it has that required method of view.onClick, or public void onClick, passing it a view object of button view. So we're going to create this new intent, and we pass it a new intent. We have a couple parameters we need to pass it. The first one we need to pass it is the button view's context, so where we're calling it from. And so we are going to just call button view .get context. And our second parameter we will pass it is the name of the new class that we're trying to access. And so if we look up here, we have running activity. But the way we pass it is like this. We do running activity .class, which gives us a reference to the actual compiled version of the code for that, so we can get access to that later. So we'll create that one line right there. And so we have that, notice that we need to do an import, so we'll go up here to the import section of code. And again, in our imports, we are going to have import android.content.intent. And so we create the first intent, and then we're going to start activity for result, and we will pass it the intent we just made, the change screen, and the option 0, which is the expectation that it's going to end properly. So we'll start activity for result, passing it change screen, which is the intent we just made, and 0. We're going to hit save. Again, since we just made a major change to something, we should always put this into our GitHub as a commit. So please do that as well at home. And so that's what we do to open the returning screen. So this one, it creates a new intent, passing it the button view.getContext. That's where it's getting the information from to create the intent. And which intent are we making? Where it's an intent to go to the running activity class. And we start an activity for that based on this. So we have that change screen we pass as a parameter. That's what the intent we're starting. That activity for result, and the expectation there is 0. We're going to go then to our running activity, and inside its setup listeners, inside the OnClickListener for that, we're going to do in its OnClick. We have a little bit different here, so what we're going to do is we're going to make an intent in here as well. This one will have no parameters passed to the constructor, but we still need to go ahead and add that import for it right here. So we'll go ahead on that and import android.content.intent. The next line we're going to do is we're going to set the result for that. So we'll call the setResult method, and I'm going to pass it a result code of simply result underscore OK, a nice constant saying that we did this properly. And the return intent, the fact that we're coming back to this. And finally, we're going to call the method finish. Finish is how I close my activity. So this turns off that activity, takes off all the memory that's attached to it, and shuts it down. And so in our return home button, we have our onClick, of course, that we've used for all of that. We have the intent that we create called the return intent, and we create as a new intent object with no parameters. We then say, we're setting the result of OK and passing it the intent that we just made that gets what we're at right now. And then we call finish, which closes everything out. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save on this, and we're going to hit play. Going back to our original activity to show how this is starting off, we have right now our app that's running, as we can see. We have our method that we added right here for our swap button, and we have the onClick method for that, where it's going to change screen by creating a new intent, passing it the button views context, and the running activity, the other screens.class parameter. And we'll start activity for result, passing it that new intent that we just created, and the value 0. So when I click on this button right here, it'll change the screen to that other one. And changing the screen right here will take us back. And if I change my colors right here, we can see the same is working, where it alternates between visible and invisible for my text section, and the colors of my background and button change each time I click. And we can see that we're actually not starting this brand new again, but merely returning to it after using it. So as we can see right here with this orange brown color and a gray button, I click on changing the screen. Lovely boring white screen with the button to go back to it, and it'll take me right back where I was, closing that entire app completely because it calls the finish method, but I'm back to that orangish brown color right here. So again, when I create an intent and start that new activity, I then go over to that other activity, and when I click its button, I create intent as well, but I set a result for it of OK, passing it that return intent, and I call that finish method. Again, the finish method removes all memory attached to this activity, in this case the running activity.java, from there. We look back over at the screen, we have PM Stupid Project, the title, and then I click over here, and it'll take me back to the screen of Mr. H Likes to Run, which we saw that was the title for that when we made the other page. We have the text right here, click here to change the screen on this button, which is the same text as this one because we made that change inside our strings.xml, so we have access to that as well. And all we had to do was, again, in both classes, we declare a button object, inner declaration section. In our onCreate method, we have to initialize that button and call setup listeners. And so this is we do that same structure is the same for both our running activity and the stupid afternoon activity. In my setup listeners for my running activity, which is the one that's the simpler one, I have just the basic structure right here where I have the setup OnClickListener, and it has an onClick method. And inside that I create the intent, passing result OK and that intent that I just made, and calling the finish method, which closes this app side entirely. So this activity and all its associated memory is cleaned out from the Android operating system, so it has availability to do stuff, which will save you time and energy in the long run. On the stupid afternoon activity, we have that same basic structure right here, where we have our declaration section, where we have added a new button, our swap button. In its onCreate, we made a button here as well. And we kept them together because our buttons stay together when we're doing these different pieces. The swap button finds the appropriate button. We call setup listeners down here. And in setup listeners, I have a listener attached to the swap button, as well as I have a separate listener for the color change button. Both of them have their onClick method, but this one has where it changes the intent. I grab its context for that button click and call the activity class of the new screen. And then I start activity for the result, passing the new intent we just created. Come in next time for our next lesson using Android development in Java. And have a great day.